So the discipline of urban science is an emerging part of science. It's about observing cities, looking at cities, and understanding them through what we can observe that may be general. So a lot of this is done through data, but a lot of this is also done through just sharing human experiences in many parts of the world and in many different circumstances. My name is Luis Betancourt. I'm currently the director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, which is a new institute at the University of Chicago dedicated to urban science and practice. So this field is emerging because we have cities becoming more and more important environments globally. So we have cities everywhere and people sharing questions and problems. But also because we have unprecedented amounts of data and ways of, again, assessing evidence that come from urban environments. And we have therefore a need to bring all this together and make sense of it. And in the last 10, 15 years, there have been a lot of progress in understanding what are the essential properties of cities that are not properties just of individuals or firms or other constituent pieces, but that then constitutes something that defines scientific vision of what cities are. In doing that, of course, it's also a kind of discipline that benefits from all the precedents in many different points of view. So it has strong roots in geography, in economics, in sociology, as well as in parts of ecology and evolution, and in certain methodological aspects from computer sciences, physics, and even data sciences. So what's important and what the book attempts to do is to bring all this together in a way that makes sense, and it's problem-driven by a fundamental understanding of how cities work, what sustains them, what could go wrong, but also in a way that's generalizable, that we can imagine what a city of the future that's bigger or has different technologies may look like. So I think the perspective of urban science and what the book attempts to do is actually important as sort of a new discipline that lives a little bit at the boundaries of more traditional disciplines, but fills a very important gap. We increasingly are thinking about cities in terms of communities, in terms of change, inequality, both at the level of what's happening between countries and what's happening in our own cities, right? A lot of inequalities between neighborhoods and so forth. And all these issues, of course, have a certain urgency that's social, that's political, that has to do with issues of sustainability and development worldwide. But we've not, in my view, we kind of need tools and context that allow us to articulate why this change is happening and how it could be different, all at the same time, right? And that requires, I think, a scientific perspective that allows us to understand what the processes are that cities harness and express, and how, for example, they could use less energy or use a different kind of energy or produce more equitable outcomes. And the book really gives you sort of a roadmap and a set of mental tools and practical tools vis-a-vis data to do just that. So it's written in a way that should allow the reader and the student to really be inspired to think for themselves, being armed of a systems perspective that allow us to conceptualize and love cities for what they are, endure them for the things that often go wrong, but then reimagine them from the point of view of things we can observe and correct for. And I think that perspective has been missing, and it's part of what we need to do, both in how we train and teach students, but also how we act in the world. So I think this book fills, in my view, an important gap in helping give readers really a map, a complicated map of what cities are, how we understand them, how we use ideas and methods from different disciplines, and how we address this issue of evidence and data that's coming at us very fast. And so it is several things at once. It's an attempt at creating sort of a framework of ideas, if you want, a framework of theory that builds on existing disciplines, but also creates connections between them and advances concepts like, cities as central markets, cities as networks, cities as spaces, and connects them together in ways that make sense and predict certain numbers, certain properties that we can observe and see if they're right or wrong. but it's also, so in that sense, it's a book that allows the reader to really get a general idea of what cities are and therefore also what they could be. It's also a book that allows people to come in from different points of view and kind of pull the thread and start seeing more and more of how their point of view is connected to other things. And it's a way for people to understand how to use evidence and experience in sort of a context that can be local. So a book works a lot across scales. So parts of the book are about neighborhoods and communities and decisions that individuals and households may make. Other parts of the book connect that to the city at large, a sort of a large network that's treated more statistically. So to be able to bridge these scales and have sort of a path that allows us to not get confused, but also see the whole, is the main purpose of the book. In doing that, I think it creates a very didactic experience of how, you know, cities unfold, how they can be understood from different points of view, from bird's eye view, from street ground view, and how all this can be part of the same thing in the same whole. So I hope it gives the reader a lot of perspective to imagine also how to deal with some of the challenges of urban environments. So in my experience, both in research, but also in teaching the materials of the book and many lectures that I give also other institutions beyond the University of Chicago and internationally, there's a great appetite, particularly by students and sometimes by professionals, about the materials of the book and sort of a perspective that allows us to integrate you know, new technologies and data and different contexts throughout the world in a way that allows us to communicate with each other, share experiences, but at the same time also ground those experiences into evidence. And so part of what urban science is trying to do, and that the book is trying to be a vehicle for, is that it's not just about facts and figures. It's really about understanding human and social processes in all their diversity, which you can only do in some sense in using statistics and variation in just the right way. So a lot of the book is about that. And a lot of the book is also about recognizing that the most important things that we observe and would like to create in cities are done through co-production and through cycles of, if you will, problems and solutions that are open-ended. So they have to do with collaboration, with co-production, with sort of a common understanding of what we are in these complex societies and what cities in particular create. So the book is trying to create sort of a different logic in which we do science that is appropriate to cities and that brings in both what we do and perceive every day, but also sort of a more abstract view that allows us to also see that in a more general context, such that we can recognize processes in cities in Africa, Asia, and the United States as having some communality, which in my experience really allows these wonderful channels for people to collaborate and work together and kind of help each other from different points of view. So the book is entitled Introduction to Urban Science. And so the use of science, the word science, in urban contexts and contexts that are intensely important from the point of view of the humanities and social sciences has always been sort of a subject of some discussion and perhaps some contention. The book tries in some sense to bridge that, even though it stays firmly on the side of seeking and trying to describe what it is about cities that we can understand that's general, you know, and how that allows us to, on the one hand, understand many of the processes that are going on and how they could be different, but at the same time also explicitly respect human agency, human experience, and sort of a sense of uniqueness and capability from the point of view of each individual and each organization. So the way that is done, that may sound to some as sort of anathema or something difficult to do, but I think that this is important to express in terms of what urban science is. The kind of things that you use to say something is general are quite simple. The fact that we live in space and time, we usually have a house, we have a budget, we need to balance it over some time. And that when we live in a city, we're very interdependent with others. So we exchange a lot of things, both through markets, but also through services and civic mechanisms and so forth. So it's this network of interdependence that's general, not so much how it's expressed for each individual, and the kind of physical and spatial and temporal constraints. And it turns out that all these things allow us to start understanding how the networks of the city have a certain general logic, while at the same time being quite diverse in each context. So it's sort of this balancing act that I think is hopefully a healing perspective towards bringing a lot of what we appreciate about cities from the humanities and some of the social sciences, and also some of the methods of science that now, natural science perhaps, that now become in some sense much more native to human and social environments. So I hope that sort of that, that kind of fusion of the two cultures towards something new is also something that the book achieves, and that hopefully can inspire people to see that there's no fundamental dichotomy. So the book tries to span and connect both sort of a humanistic perspective or approach to what cities are and all the wonderful and difficult things that we do together in these environments, from inventing new forms of politics to art and expression and innovation to many other things, and to try to give us a sense of why they're necessary in these environments. And at the same time, it provides a lot of evidence, a lot of data and graphs and so forth that allow us to understand how those connect to things we can measure, and also what the imperfections are of those measurements. And so hopefully there's a little bit for both the students that is more quantitative and wants to start with methods and data. And there are some exercises that I do with all my students that way. But also it's very important that they keep a sense of ideas of why are cities such engines of novelty and innovation in human societies, why they sustain so much diversity and must invent new political and social forms that in some sense integrate very diverse people into sometimes common cause. How are these problems negotiated, and how can we observe them in a way to make sense of them? So the way I teach it, I really try to touch all at the same time and challenge my students towards both the concepts, which often have even philosophical dimensions, but certainly have practical dimensions, but also the methods and what we should desire from the methods in terms of understanding these issues and their connections. So when I teach, I teach a 18 lecture course at the University of Chicago with the same title. It's part of a very interdisciplinary program called the Program of Global Environment, but I have students all the way from the arts and humanities, all the way a lot of people from social sciences and policy, all the way to people in computer science and physics and data sciences. And so I have many different points of view also in class, which I think is wonderful. And the way we do sort of assignments and grading is that I give students every week an option of a more conceptual and a more methods, often data-driven exercise. And so students can take a little bit of their own path through the material and pick up different kinds of expertise as they go. And that has worked very well and even creates interesting dialogues between students as to what they like to do and why, and how they're missing sometimes a little bit of the other piece. So teaching is always a little bit personal, right? But I've developed sort of a pathway through this material in an 18 lecture format. And so the book has a lot more detail than the lecture slides and lecture materials, but I'm making available my slides that depend on, that connect to some materials in the books, like the figures and passages and even some of the citations, such that somebody could start there and use those slides either to give the course along the lines I do, or to use it as raw material to pick and choose towards different themes. As structured, the course has a long arc. I call it sort of a grand tour of urban concepts that allow you to understand where ideas about cities came from, how we understand them much more in terms of networks and connected systems with their own dynamics, and then issues that have been puzzling to people that don't belong to a single discipline, but belong to urban science, having to do with diversity, productivity, origins of economic growth as they're embedded in communities, issues of neighborhood effects, issues of information, and how they play out in cities, and how they become sort of an engine for tracking pattern and change. So there's sort of a logic to this that will allow any instructor to pick up the slides and to teach either the entire course in this format, or to also have essentially 3 modules per lecture, so about 20 or 30 minutes, and then be able to build their own puzzle through the material. I have a very diverse background. I've always loved cities sort of as a person and wanted to study them, but I had to collect many pieces. So I studied in physics and statistical mechanics, non-equilibrium systems. Then I became very interested in issues of health and evolution and biology, and I'm now a professor of ecology and evolution. And my passion always was to understand people and how they come together to create complicated things like cities. And I'm also associated faculty with sociology. So out of this, I've created sort of a path through complex systems, which allow us to integrate many of these disciplines, but also create something new that is a kind of science that informs practice and allows us to understand cities scientifically.